A dull red glow pulsed through the cargo bay, the flickering emergency lights casting elongated shadows across cold metal walls. The air was thin, stale with the scent of rust and scorched wiring. Amid the wreckage, bound to the bulkhead by a thick length of electro chain, lay Sahri. Her limbs ached, every muscle depleted of strength. The Visari were not built for endurance in such conditions. Her body, sleek and feline, was meant for dense forests and sprawling plains, not the suffocating confines of a dying starship. Her fur, once a deep iridescent blue, was matted with grime and dry blood. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the fragile warmth curled against her side. 3 tiny forms pressed against her, their small chests rising and falling with fitful breaths. Her kittens, barely days old, blind and defenseless. They mewed softly, seeking comfort, and Sahri tightened her tail around them, willing them to feel safe. But the truth loomed over her like the ship's failing hull. She was running out of time. The ship was dead. She had felt at the moment the battle ended, when a last explosion had rattled through the corridors and silence had taken its place. The raiders who had captured her had fled, abandoning their spoils, leaving the ship crippled and adrift. In their haste, they had not bothered to free her. Or perhaps they had intended for her to die here, another piece of debris in the vast nothingness of space. A tremor rippled through the floor, faint but unmistakable. Sahri's ears flicked, her instincts sharpening despite her exhaustion. The ship was moving, not through propulsion, but through inevitability. She forced her head up, straining against the weight of her captivity. The reinforced viewport at the far end of the bay showed only the blackness of space, but she knew what lurked beyond the void. A star. Its gravitational pull had begun to claim the wreckage, drawing it into its fatal embrace. She did not need an exact countdown. Whether it was hours or minutes, the end was certain. A hollow acceptance settled in her chest, warring with the primal need to fight. She was a mother. A Visari did not abandon their young. But how could she protect them when her own body was failing? The cargo bay silence was punctuated by the distant hum of a ship's systems, the kind of automated process that persisted long after the crew had gone. Then faint, almost imperceptible, a sound that did not belong. A metallic scrape, deliberate and controlled. Sahri's ears flattened. Something moved in the corridors beyond the bay. She curled instinctively over her kittens, her weakened body coiling in a protective stance. Her breath came slow and measured, her heart pounding in her ears. She knew the sounds of the ship. This was different. This was someone. The door to the cargo hold hissed, its sluggish hydraulics forcing the heavy panel open just enough for a figure to slip through. A human. Sahri did not move, only watched, every fiber of her being poised between fear and defiance. The human was tall, clad in the dark, scuffed remnants of a military uniform. His movements were cautious but not hesitant, his eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone accustomed to survival. She had seen humans before, had fought them, had fled from them. The wars between their species had left scars in history, deep and bitter. She had no reason to trust this one. His gaze landed on her, his expression unreadable. He took a slow step forward, then halted. The dim light glinted off a streak of dried blood on his temple. He had not come out of the battle unscathed. Perhaps, like her, he had been left behind. For a long moment, neither moved. Then impossibly his gaze shifted downward. His expression changed, the barest flicker of something not unlike recognition. Sahri's tail tightened around her kittens. A soldier, a predator, a human. And yet, in that moment, she saw something else in his face. Hesitation. The human did not move closer. His breathing was steady, his stance balanced, prepared for either fight or flight. The emergency lights cast deep shadows across his face, accentuating the sharpness of his features, the hardened lines of someone who had spent too long in the grip of war. Sahri did not trust him. She had no reason to. Yet as his gaze lingered on the small, trembling forms pressed against her, something shifted. Not pity, something more complicated. His eyes flicked to the chain, securing her to the bulkhead. A moment of calculation passed over his face, and then, slowly, he reached for the pouch strapped to his belt. Sahri tensed, claws slipping from their sheaths, but he did not draw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small, worn multi-tool and held it up, letting the dim light catch on its edge. A silent offer. Sahri did not answer. She could not afford to. She had seen how quickly kindness could be a mask for cruelty. But her hesitation was not the only force at play. Her body betrayed her. The exhaustion, the weight of too many days without food, the slow, relentless pull of death creeping toward them all. The human must have seen it. Without another word, he crouched near the base of the chain and began working at the lock. His hands were practiced, his fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. The metal was thick, reinforced, but he did not stop. Sahri forced herself to stay still. The proximity of a human, so close, sent every instinct in her body screaming. Her people had warred against them for years, had suffered under the weight of their dominion. The Visari had been hunted, feared, misunderstood. And yet here she was, allowing one to inch closer, to break the bond that held her in place. The ship groaned around them, the structure shifting as unseen forces took hold. A warning. Time was slipping away. The human muttered something under his breath, shaking the multi-tool as if that would somehow make it work faster. It was then that she noticed the streak of blood at his temple was fresh. He had been injured, likely left behind just as she had. A soldier abandoned by his own. That did not make him her ally, but it did make him desperate. Desperation had a way of making enemies useful. Sahri's tail twitched as she studied him. He was strong but weary, disciplined but fraying at the edges. She could smell it on him, the lingering scent of battle, of sweat and metal, and the faint, unmistakable trace of sorrow. The lock gave a soft click. The chain loosened. Sahri did not lunge. She did not strike. She only lowered her head, breathing through the sudden absence of restraint. Her body ached, muscles stiff and uncooperative, but she forced herself upright. The human had already stepped back, giving her space. Wise. Another tremor rattled through the ship, stronger this time. Sahri's ears flicked toward the distant corridors, where the failing structure moaned under the pull of the star. They had little time before the wreck was dragged to its fiery end. The human seemed to come to the same conclusion. He pulled something from his belt, a scanner, worn at the edges, and studied the readings. His jaw tightened. "Escape pods are on the other side of the ship," he said, his voice low, measured. Sahri understood the words, even through the thick, human accent. Language was not a barrier. The question now was trust. The human turned to her, waiting, not commanding, not assuming, just waiting. Sahri's tail curled around her young, who had begun stirring against her fur. They needed to move. The only choice was whether she moved alone. Another shudder, another ripple of metal bending where it should not. The human made his decision first. He moved toward the door, pausing only once to glance back. Sahri hesitated for half a breath. Then she followed. The corridor was a ruin of twisted metal and flickering lights, the ship's structure groaning under the strain of its inevitable collapse. The human moved quickly, his footsteps steady despite the uneven floor. Sahri followed, her movements slower, unsteady. Every muscle in her body burned, but she forced herself forward. The kittens were bundled in the fabric of his jacket, held carefully against his chest. He had taken them without hesitation, as if the act required no thought. She had not stopped him. She had no choice but to trust that he would protect them. Another tremor shook the ship, and the floor beneath them tilted sharply. The human caught himself against the wall, his arms shooting out instinctively to steady her as well. Sahri flinched at the touch, but she did not pull away. The air was growing hotter, the ship's failing systems struggling to hold back the heat of the star that loomed beyond the hull. "The escape pods should be ahead," he said, glancing at the small device in his hand. "If they're still intact. If." They moved faster. The corridor narrowed, forcing them into single file. The human led, his free hand brushing against the wall for balance. Sahri stayed close behind, each step measured, her ears flicking at every sound. The ship was dying, its final moments stretching thin, but something about the silence ahead was wrong. Too empty, too expectant. The human slowed. He smelled it before he saw it. Gunpowder, oil, blood. They rounded the final bend, and the corridor opened into a small chamber where the escape pods lined the walls like waiting coffins. 3 were already missing, ejected into the void. 1 remained. A figure stood in front of it, blocking their path. The space raider was tall, broad-shouldered, his armor scorched but functional. The insignia on his chest was faded, but Sahri recognized the mark. This was not a scavenger who had been left behind by accident. This was a man who had chosen to remain, waiting for the last way out. He lifted his gun, slow and deliberate, aiming directly at the human's chest. "Keycard," the raider said. His voice was rough, cracked from thirst. "Now!" The human did not move. The kitten stirred against him, shifting in his jacket. Sahri's claws flexed against the floor. She could see the way the human's muscles tensed, his breath slowing, calculating. He was weighing his options. He was unarmed, burdened. The raider had the advantage. Unless... Sahri stepped forward. The raider's gun shifted, tracking her movement. His stance was solid, practiced, but she could see the slight tremor in his fingers. He was not as composed as he wanted to appear. Her kind had never needed weapons. She reached for him, not with her body, but with her mind. It took everything she had left, every ounce of energy she could summon. Her consciousness pressed against his, slipping through the cracks of his focus, sinking into the marrow of his thoughts. His mind recoiled, but she was already inside. She let him feel what she felt, the heat closing in, the weight of exhaustion, the certainty of death. She let him choke on it, let him drown. His grip faltered, his breath caught, his arms wavered for the barest moment. The human lunged. A single strike, quick, brutal. The gun clattered to the floor, and the raider crumpled beside it. The human did not wait. He grabbed the key card from his belt and slammed it into the panel beside the escape pod. The hatch hissed open. Inside, he ordered. Sahri did not hesitate. She climbed in, pressing herself into the small space as he followed, sealing the door behind them. The release sequence engaged. The pod jolted, the ship's hull falling away as they shot into the void. Through the viewport, she watched as the wreckage of the ship succumbed to the pull of the star, flames consuming its twisted form. The human exhaled beside her, his head resting back against the pod's wall. His jacket shifted, and one of the kittens wriggled free, mewing softly. Carefully, he pulled the tiny creature into his palm, cradling it as if it were something fragile. His thumb brushed over its small head, a quiet, absent gesture. Sahri watched him, her own exhaustion pressing down like a weight. A human, a soldier, a creature she had been taught to fear. And yet, he had carried her young. The pod's navigation system flickered to life, displaying a nearby habitable station. A destination, a future. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of survival.